Wonderful to see all of you. And already having so much fun. This is wonderful. Hi, my name is Kathy, and I'm part of the events team here with Jackie, who is working this event with me as well. And we're so happy to have you with us here this evening. We will have a signing afterwards, so if you're able to stay and you'd like to purchase the book at this register or the register on the other side of the room, we will have copies for sale. I'm going to give a very brief introduction because we have so much to talk about this evening. So Carol Kino is writing about art, artists, the art world, and contemporary culture, and has appeared in publications such as The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The Atlantic, Slate, Town and Country, and just about every major art magazine. She was formerly a fellow at the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center at the New York Public Library and the USC Annenberg Getty Arts Journalism Program. She grew up on the Stanford campus in Northern California and lives in Manhattan. Double Click is her first book, and we have that here with us. Our feature author tonight is Julie Satow, and she's an award-winning journalist and the author of The Plaza, a New York Times Editor's Choice and NPR favorite book of 2019. And she is a regular contributor to the New York Times. There is so much to share. So let me quickly just say that Julie's book is a USA Today bestseller, a Cosmopolitan Best Nonfiction Book of 2024, a Town and Country must read for summer 2024. And there are so many wonderful reviews, but I had to at least capture a couple of them. Maureen Corrigan of Fresh Air, you may have seen, she said, a treat for anyone like me who yearns to time travel back to some of those palaces of consumption at the height of their grandeur. But even more revelatory are the stories Satow excavates of the women who presided over three of the greatest and now vanished New York department stores. And a very special staff suggestion, which was the owner of our store, Roxanne Cody. She said, I love this on several levels. It's a fascinating history of department store retail. It's a fascinating story about three trailblazing women. It's about fashion, and it's about female executives at a time when there were few or none. Satow is a great writer who completed a ton of in-depth research. You may not think you want to read this, but I encourage you to take the peek. So let's get ready to hear more directly from Julie and Carol this evening. How timely that we are talking about powerful trailblazing women who become presidents. Thankfully, we will have time for Q&A. So be sure those cell phones are silenced. Let's enjoy this discussion together. Please welcome Julie Satow and Carol Kino. So Julie, what did you come to write this book?
Wow. Okay, let's jump right in. I also just want to say thank you guys so much for that. Thank you, Kathy, for that beautiful introduction. I'm also a New York Times bestseller. I just had to put that in there because my mom. But also thank you all for coming. It's so fun to be here. Okay, so your question was, how did I come to write the book? Oh, that's a loaded question. So I finished. I know, right? Yeah. I had finished writing The Plaza, and I wasn't really sure what to do next. And my agent suggested that I do a book on store wars. Not forward, forwards. And I really wanted to write about women, or people at least, characters in the book. And so I didn't really want it to be about buildings because that sort of felt like I'd done that. So there was a New York Times article about the closure of Lord and Taylor and Henry Bendel's within weeks of each other. And in the article, it mentioned two of the women that are in my book, Dorothy Shaver and Geraldine Stutz. And I kind of went down this crazy research rabbit hole, which I'm sure you relate to, about who these women were. And I had never heard of them before. And they were so fascinating. And then I found Hortense Odlum, the third woman in my book, and I just felt like the three of them, they really, even though they weren't friends with each other, they really spoke to one another, and their careers really represented the entirety of the 20th century and the history of retail and the heyday of these department stores. And it just felt like the perfect way to tell the story.
Okay. I was wondering what led you to pick those three subjects, but you told us exactly. Were there women that you considered and rejected as subjects?
There were, there's a lot that goes into like figuring out who to choose. You have to think about what documents are available, because it is nonfiction. That none of these women had ever had biographies written about them before, so there was a dearth of material. That said, within their lifetimes, they were actually quite famous. So there was a lot of newspaper archives I had to go on. And there were other reasons why I felt like from a research perspective, there was enough material to make it work. I also just felt like their challenges, they were each so unique and different. And there were other women, but I tried to narrow it down to those who became president. So that was a way to kind of like create some continuity between them and compare their journeys. So that was something.
They were also fascinating because they all approached their lives as women so differently. I mean, they seem to be, none of them, I don't think any of them had children, did they? And they didn't really, one of them, the first one had children, but they all had their relationships or new relationships in various ways. And I wondered if that was something you thought about consciously as you were putting it together, or did it just happen that way?
Well, I was doing the bulk of my research during the pandemic, and I was home with two little children. Trying to work. So I felt so much affinity for these women trying to create careers at a time when that was so rare and so difficult. And I felt like just a lot of fascination and also shock at the fact that as far back as 1906, I found a saleswoman who, she started out as a dusting the china of a department store in San Francisco and ended up in her 20s, earning enough to support her entire family, moving them out of the Mission District and buying them a beautiful home. And I felt like, wow, back in 1906, this was happening. I didn't realize kind of the long trajectory of what women had gone through and how sort of my foremothers, I guess, had paved the way for me. So that was a big thing. I felt like the fact that they had, I guess, complex love lives, or some have no love lives, was indicative of the challenges they were going through. So I felt sadness about it, especially for Hortense, which she was quite a complicated character, which we can get into. But I felt like, it was a sign of what you had to sacrifice, really, to become so successful in that era. So,
What did you? I'm curious to know what you thought of the truth of Dorothy Shaver's love life, which was always, she was rumored to have one, perhaps, or rumored by her family maybe to have one, but nothing was ever apparent.
yeah. So
What was your real take on that?
yeah. So
She
maybe
was the president of Oregon.
Yeah.
And an incredibly powerful and influential businesswoman and molder and tastes,
yeah.
I would say.
Yes, I would agree. Yeah, I can just step back and give you, like, for those of you who haven't read the book, like a very brief overview of the three women. So, and there are other women and other stores in there, but Hortense Odlum was the president of Bonwit Teller during the Great Depression. And through various ways and means, she came from a very small town in Utah, very far away from Fifth Avenue, making her own clothes and her own food. So it was an interesting journey to get there. She, was a real powerhouse, and she was married, although the marriage didn't last, and had two children. Dorothy Shaver was the president of William Taylor. She arrived in New York City in 1919 with her sister, just a suitcase between them. They came from Mena, Arkansas, which I went to, and it's incredibly small, even today. So, and she, they started a business. They were very fascinating, and I can get into that. But she joined Lord & Taylor in 1924, and by 1945, she was president of the store. And she really, she was quite different from Hortense, who was a more traditional, she was a stay-at-home mom. She had never had a job before she became president of the Teller. Dorothy did not have a family. She was a spinster and lived with her sister the whole time. And as you mentioned, I was never able to really confirm that she had any love life at all. In many ways, she really aped a kind of male CEO. She, she was she dressed quite somberly, and, she didn't like, to accent any of her femininity, even in newspaper articles. And, she was very much like, her best friend was, the guy who ran IBM at the time in the 40s. So you can imagine, like, she was very much this kind of male figure in many ways. And I couldn't really, I thought maybe for a while that her sister wasn't her sister, because they lived together their whole life. But I found their birth certificates; they were biologically sisters. So I talk a little bit about the spinster concept and what that meant, and how it was in those years, in the 40s and 50s. And then Geraldine Stutz was the president of Henry Bendel. She was a fashion magazine editor, and she, in 1959, when she was 33, she became president of the store. And she had various lovers and relationships, and she was married for a time, but she did not have any children. And she was a more modern iteration in the 60s and 70s of what we think of as kind of the modern career woman in many ways. She was, yeah.
Mhm. Well, they all dealt with men all the time because that was the power structure of the world they were working in. And they all dealt with them in such interesting ways, I thought, and quite differently too. Could you characterize that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, what I think is interesting is all three of them wouldn't have had their positions without men. So they each had a mentor of sorts that paved the way for them. And I think, I think that's notable. I don't know exactly what to make of it, but I think it's notable. I mean, there were no other women to help bring them up at the time. So for Hortense, it was her husband who to read the book, but he had her become president. And Dorothy, the president of Lord & Taylor, was very forward thinking at the time, and he really believed in women in the workplace. He said they could do anything but fight in a war. And that was in like the 1920s, he said that. So he was very forward thinking, and he helped promote her. And then for Geraldine, she had a businessman, Maxie Jarman, who was kind of a big retailer, and he was amazing with women. He promoted several women to big jobs in different businesses that he owned. So he really believed in her. So yeah.
And these were platonic relationships. Yeah.
Although for Geraldine, there was a roman clef that was written about her, like very sort of thinly veiled romance novel in the 1970s, and they made this Maxie Jarman, her male mentor, be a love interest, but it was nothing.
But they used their, I suppose, feminine wiles or feminine attributes to, I don't know. I don't know if that's the right word, but.
Well, they were women.
But they use them to their advantage. I forget the detail. There was really funny anecdotes about Dorothy Shaver.
Well, in like, she had this, so when she was made president of Lord & Taylor, is quite a big deal. She was the first woman to earn like essentially the equivalent of about $1.6 million a year for her salary. It was less than the man who she replaced, but it was a big deal. It was the highest published salary that I know of for a woman at that time. And Life magazine had this big profile of her, and they essentially said, I don't have the quote, but it was something to the effect of like, business women are horrible and no one likes them, but she's not like that. She belongs to the little woman's school, she's scared of thunderstorms and can't light her own cigarettes. That was how they described her. So she actually said after that, she basically like never talked to the press, because all they wanted to do was like ask her about, how she did her makeup and her hair. Not her thing.
the book is structured in a really interesting way, because it weaves in and out between the different stories of the different women drawing parallels between their lives, even though they take place in different areas. And then there are all of these really interesting anecdotes that don't necessarily fit into their stories about, which I found completely
It was an editing issue. Yeah,
about women in other cities anyway,
Yeah.
you know why you decided to do it
Yeah,
that way.
I called them vignettes. I don't know, that's what my editor and I called them, sort of interspersed within the narrative are these other stories that are so fabulous and, you know, don't exactly relate to the three women directly, but really help, I think, fill out the picture of the world that they all lived in. And so I felt it was important to include it. Actually, I mentioned this woman from 1906 who started out as a dust girl and then became quite a powerful buyer in San Francisco in the 1910s. And that was my first vignette. I actually found that story and I was like, I want to use it, but it's not like, you know, exactly the thing. And I just pitched it to the editors, like, could we put it in italics and have it as like a little vignette and I can do them through, you know, because there were amazing stories like the history of the mannequin. I want to put that in, you know, it was great. You know, so many other things like that. So they were into it. So that's what happened.
It worked out beautifully, I thought. I mean, and it's so frustrating when one's writing a book and comes across
Great stuff.
wonderful
You don't want to
material
leave.
that doesn't
Exactly.
fully fit into the narrative,
Yeah.
but
I think it's real, you know, it's important because, you know, I have a story about, for instance, the first Black women-owned department store, which happened right after the Civil War in Richmond, Virginia, which was the seat of the Confederacy. So you can imagine what that was like, and the amazing woman who started this department store, and she managed to have it for about 6 years before all the white retailers ran her out of town, essentially. But you know, so that kind of stuff is important, I think, for if you want to understand the history of department stores. So
and then there's another one about the history of the Jews in department stores,
Yeah.
which is
yeah, I mean, none of my women are, they're Mormon, a lapsed Catholic and a Protestant, but yes, I felt like the retail industry is very, so there's some interesting women, Jewish women who started stores, so.
Was there one store that was easier to write about than the others? I wondered if Bendel's was.
Yes.
That one really seemed to sing because you
Oh.
had
Live
you were able to talk to so
people.
many participants, I
Yes.
assume.
So, obviously, all the women are no longer alive, but, you know, Bendel's was really the 1960s, 1970s through kind of the 80s. So there were a lot of people who had worked for Geraldine, who had worked at Bendel's, who had shopped at Bendel's. I came in at the very tail end of it, you know, so I had some memories. So I was able to do actual reporting where I could just interview live people. So that was really great, you know, family members, people. It was just a more recent history. So that was easier. It was also easier just because I understood it better. It was a store that, you know, I can imagine that I had, whereas Bonnet Teller, I mean, Lord and Taylor, I definitely have some memories. My grandmother loved Lord and Taylor, but you know, it was a little more in the historic past. So yeah.
How did you go about finding those sources?
Yeah, the research was very intense.
Yeah,
I mean,
within
it's my
general.
favorite part, but yes, it was, so as I mentioned, none of the women had biographies written about them. So there was some, you know, dissertations, PhD dissertations I was able to find a bit of information. Dorothy was quite famous within her lifetime. She helped really found the American fashion industry in so many ways. So there's actually an archive in the Smithsonian of hers. I also hired a genealogist for her because I wasn't able to find any living family members. And he found her great niece, which was amazing. I called her up. It was like the dream for a researcher. She was like, sure, my basement is filled with scrapbooks.
Wow.
Come on down. And so that was like amazing because Dorothy's sister, who I said, you know, she lived with her whole life, was this very talented artist, and she created all these scrapbooks of their life together and memories and diaries. So that was really amazing. For Hortense, you know, I went to all their hometowns, and the Mormons are very interested in their genealogies. So in St. George, Utah, where she's from, they had the Pioneer Museum, and it had all of her genealogy, and so that was really great. And I was able to track down the grandkids, stuff like that, and
Did they have material?
very little. They hated her. They had a relationship with their grandmother, so they had very few photos and just some small memories, which I was able to work in. There also, she wrote a memoir, which was very interesting because a lot of it is fake. And that was like very hard to figure out. I didn't realize. Like she, you know, and I think this is probably true for many memoirs. Certainly, you know, she was the president of the store in 1937, and she wrote a memoir about, you know, for instance, she had been long divorced from her husband, but throughout the entire book, she calls him her husband. You know, there were just a lot of kind of like refashioning her life in a much more positive light. So trying to figure out what was real and what was kind of her fantasy of her life was challenging, but also very useful. Like a lot of the dialogue in the book is taken from her memoir, which was great to have. So things like that.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
One of the chapters I found most fascinating was the one about the post-war suburban sprawl and the branch expansions of the department stores, and how that eventually led essentially to the downfall of the department store and the rise of the discounters. That was fascinating because that deals with our current lives.
Yes.
Basically.
Yes.
And I mean, it's something I've been thinking about a lot, how department stores, certainly within my experience, used to be a really reliable place for women, young women, to be able to go and find a job, you know, and maybe have some possibility of advancement. And now that's completely disappeared. That's no longer really an option.
Well, and I should say, you know, the department store of your sort of when these women were around, these were not like the department stores we know of today at all, or even of the 80s. You know, these were worlds unto themselves. They had 2,000 employees. They had nurseries where you could drop your kids off and go shopping and go have lunch. You know, they of course had hair salons. Some had zoos, like miniature zoos. They had the largest collection of grand pianos, you know, just these amazing places where they were entire worlds, and the way they treated their staff was wonderful in many ways. I mean, it was a hard job, but you know, they offered classes on etiquette. They gave them free vacations. Many of them had, you know, country houses upstate, and they would send all the staff for free trips up there. You know, they had lunchrooms for them to make sure they were well fed, all these things that, you know, we just couldn't envision today. But yes, so then in the 50s, with the suburban sprawl and suburbia, branch, you know, Dorothy actually, and Lord and Taylor was one of the first to open branch stores in Long Island, where my husband is from actually. You know, why go to New York City if you can go down the street and buy the same things, right? Why deal with the hassle? So people started going to the branch stores, and that began to dilute the department stores and dilute their brand somewhat. And then in the early 60s, actually in 1962, Walmart, Kmart, and Target all opened in the same year. And it began a kind of price competition with the department stores, and this kind of downward spiral where they began cutting their services, they began cutting salaries, they began, you know, lessening what they offered to compete with these discount stores. And then of course, the internet. So that was kind of the death knell. So that's kind of the process of what occurred.
Was it originally something that you really did have to go into a city to experience? I guess it was.
I mean,
It
yes, but
started-
every town had one. That's the thing, they were very regional. I mean, and even the big New York City stores were regional, you know, they catered to their audience. So every town, I mean, I'm not sure about Madison, but you know, I would assume very close by, you probably had your local department store. It was probably family owned. And, you know, you all went there and they knew kind of what you guys liked. And what was great about them is, and we don't find this really today in department stores, is that you could buy $10 packs of underwear. You could also buy a mink coat. You could buy all kinds of things, right? And now they're very, like, even the ones that exist are typically very bifurcated by the market. So they, you know, there's Marshalls for, you know, or TJ Maxx, or there's Bergdorf Goodman, you know, there's not a lot of, and Macy's, which is sort of in between, is now on its last leg. So.
And the really great ones, you could buy things like.
I mean, some of them were amazing. You should read my book about all the crazy things they did. I mean, one had actually is like a marketing like scheme. They had an adoption week where they actually had babies that they gave up for adoption. So this store in Oklahoma City, yeah, they actually, I think like 6 babies were adopted. Okay, so you could even get a baby. Yeah, yeah.
So you tell some wonderful stories in the book that are relevant to the present day, like the story about Donald Trump.
It's not political. I'm not a politics reporter. Yeah.
But when he had bought Bonwitz and had it
Yes.
torn down.
Yes.
And, that's an amazing
Yes.
story.
Yes, in 1979, Donald Trump was a very young, kind of, you know, up and coming developer, and he bought the Bonwit Teller building and he demolished it to make Trump Tower. So that's where Trump Tower is now. So I get into that story and how that occurred. You know, Lord and Taylor, the building is still there, but it's now an Amazon headquarters, the headquarters in New York City. And Bendel's is vacant. So, and actually the original Bendel's is demolished. So it's a vacant lot.
Tell us.
What? Sorry.
Do you think anything like the department store will come back? Because there seems to have been such a huge response to the book.
Oh, thanks. I mean, gosh, I would love it. I don't know. I think financially, you know, I wrote a book about the Plaza Hotel. I mean, the big hotels don't make a lot of financial sense anymore. And I think in many ways, you know, certainly the big department stores of history, I think are no longer financially feasible. I do think something like a Bendel's could be great and could happen. But, you know, a lot of these stores are
Like
running.
Bendel's in particular.
Well,
because that's
yeah.
different from the other departments.
Yes, so Bendel's, so Geraldine, when she came, Bendel's was kind of this down and out. I mean, it was, you know, a lot of like wealthy dowagers shop there, but certainly no one young and no one fashion forward. And she came in, she was this young, very beautiful executive. And Bendel's is was much smaller than most department stores. So, you know, they had a hard time competing, and it led to all these cool things that she did because she was thought outside the box. You know, but basically she created a jewel box department store. So in many ways, or it's called a specialty store. It was very small and very specifically curated according to her taste, and she had amazing taste. So it was an amazing, fantastic place. So I think that kind of a thing could last. And you know, for instance, you know, it's much smaller, so she couldn't compete with Bergdorf's or Saks Fifth Avenue or any of them. So they would all be buying Christian Dior and all these big, you know, Chanel, and she couldn't afford to place these huge orders. So the big houses basically ignored Bendel's. So what she had, her right-hand woman was this woman, Jean Rosenberg, and she sent her, for instance, in the late 50s, early 60s to Europe. And don't go to the big fashion shows, don't go to the couture fashion shows, go to the side streets and find what these designers are doing. And it essentially became pret-a-porter, or ready to wear. She helped found it because she was trying to compete with the big stores. So Sonia Rykiel, Jean Muir, all these big designers of that era, she discovered that way. So that was just like one example of how, you know, so I feel like something like that could potentially make it.
Something smaller and more refined.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. So these women were virtually forgotten by the time that you wrote about them.
Virtually,
They were. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Dorothy Shaver is in my book to some
Yes.
degree, and I was amazed that I could not find anything about her except for one doctoral, I think it was a master's thesis. actually.
Yes.
I mean, there's almost nothing.
Yeah.
Now there is more, so thank you. But why do you think they did become so forgotten when what they did was really, I mean, it's really easy pickings if you want to write a book about women in the 20th century or many centuries.
I know.
because they-
Both Carol and I are looking for new book ideas, so there's a lot to mind.
Oh, you have to just
Um,
find them.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a lot of, marginalized people, their histories. I think, they've just been, look, it's so much history is forgotten if you don't purposely keep it, in the public sphere. So,
But successful women are really forgotten, and that is a really fascinating thing to me.
Yeah. And-
Majorly successful.
and I think that they're having a bit of a renaissance, in like, there's a lot of book competition about women doing, and what they accomplished in history. But for instance, Dorothy Shaver, I think there was another book coming out in August, which talks about the American look, which was something that she founded, and basically about how during World War II, obviously Paris is the center of fashion, right? And New York, through the 1940s was really like the rag trade, it was the garment district. It was the guys in the factories churning out these cheap dresses for the mass market, and there was no such thing as American fashion, that was a total oxymoron. And so Dorothy really saw that issue, and during World War II, when Paris was occupied by the Nazis, all of a sudden, they couldn't get any fashions from Paris. And she saw it as a wonderful opportunity to really highlight all these American designers. So she opened an American design department at Lord & Taylor that only sold American design clothes. And it was really through her and other women and other people too, Vogue magazine, some other, efforts that it became the American look, and essentially it's sportwear. It's everything, in Paris, everything was coming out couture, these very fancy gowns, and Americans wanted to go to football games. They wanted to have picnics. They wanted to run around with their kids. So the American designers started creating fashions that were much more suitable to the American woman, and that became sportswear. So there's a book coming out that's just focusing on that
That's
specific
really
story. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, that's fascinating.
Competition.
Okay. That's irritating.
Let's get mine first. It'll be a group.
So, I think we can go to questions at this point, yeah. Yes.
How do you think women like Tiana Greenland supported these women back in the era?
Yeah, I mean, she came a little bit later than some of the women I'm talking about, but I do think that there was something called the Fashion Group International. It still exists, and it was a group of women. Actually, Eleanor Roosevelt was part of it, and Dorothy and a number of other women, and Geraldine was part of it later on too. And they really tried to help promote women within the industry, and it was a very important. It started out very small in the 30s, but by the time of, I think Diana was part of that too. And it became a whole thing where they tried to do career development and mentorships, that kind of thing for women in the fashion industry. So, yeah.
How did Lord and Taylor get its name?
Oh, okay. Samuel Lord and George Washington Taylor. It was one of the America's oldest department stores. It began on, I think, Catherine Street in the early 1800s, which is like the south, like the seaport area of Manhattan. It was a dry goods store, which most of them were, which was sort of a general store. You think of a general store. That's how a lot of these stores began. He came from England, and his cousin Samuel Lord came from England. I think his cousin was it was his cousin George Washington Taylor who joined him, and they essentially built this dry goods business. It moved uptown, and then I think in 1913 or something, it moved to where we might all remember on Fifth Avenue and 38th, yeah. So, they moved there and that was really, it was, two family members who started it, so. There's a really good book about the origins of the store, actually, that they put out in like their 50th anniversary. It's really interesting.
So I saw the TV show Mr. Selfridge, which was fascinating, of talking about the world that the people who worked at the store lived in and how they were treated. And then I started thinking about Harrods in London, and that's such a unique store. Do you think because it's British, or do you think because it's so unique that it still survived and it's got it's got a brand?
I do think in Europe, they have much better department stores. I don't know, Paris certainly has like, Le Bon Marché is the first one
Right.
that's still going. Harrods actually, from what I haven't been there in many years, but my understanding is actually like, it looks great on the outside, but inside it's not what it used to be. And it had the same kind of thing where there were mergers and corporate ownership and, people that were buying who didn't really know what they were doing, or owners who cared more about profit than the environment. So I think Harrods, but there's another British store,
Selfridges?
not Selfridges,
Hey,
I will think of it. I will think of it, but that is actually like very high end and doing well still, but
I think they have that sushi restaurant at the very top where the sushi goes in a,
yeah, I think
it's like, yeah.
I can hear you guys.
Well, thank you.
We can figure it out, but yeah, so I think that, I also think, yeah, for whatever, they have different financial, real estate is less maybe in some of these places. I think there's other things that play into why they've been able to maintain their stores better than we have. I love that show too. So,
What is the name of that?
Selfridges.
Mr.
Yes.
Selfridge, yeah.
Yeah,
Sort of lectured by a guy who worked.
It was on for 4 seasons.
And one of the things he said about Americans is that we are over retail. And so maybe in London, Paris and London, maybe we have less. I mean, you go to a mall today, if there is a mall that still exists, and you see the same product for one over and over again, you don't know how they get survived. Saying that we just have too much here.
I mean, that could very well be the case. A lot of these places have like, it used to be, as I was saying, like, you'd have a family-owned store and the family would live in the community and they know the community and they'd be buying things that the community wanted, my family's from Pittsburgh, like Kaufman's was where they shopped, and that was kind of the thing. And then what happened was when the price wars started and the profitability started, the profit margin started to decrease, they started to get like corporate ownerships and merging. So you'd have someone in Ohio buying for the store in Pittsburgh. They'd have no idea what they wanted. And so you'd start getting the same thing in all the stores and exactly kind of what you're talking about.
If I can interject.
Yeah.
I think we just have incredibly steep discounts here that Europe doesn't have in the same way. I mean, you can't get things cheaply there.
Yeah.
In the same way. I never buy it full price.
Yeah.
Europe,
Yeah.
It's right. It's just-
I want to go with women as a for how they develop the window display. Questions that we just kind of take for granted. Is there something that, not about the women, but about retail generally, they're like, wow, that.
Yeah. The first Pilates studio, I was like, what? Was at Mendel's, which is like, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Joseph Pilates, Pilates was very, Geraldine Stutz was very chic and all the chic people were doing Pilates and she was friends with Joseph Pilates in the 60s and she convinced him to come and open a Pilates studio. And it was the first Pilates studio outside of his original studio. And it was at Bendel's on the 8th floor. That was, really amazing, surprising. That's one thing, but there was a lot of things like that, or the guy that wrote The Wizard of Oz, he was the one who actually helped create like all the window displays that, even the story like here uses it. He was the sort of architect of window display and he was, L. Frank Baum. I have no idea.
We have another question here.
It was a comment, reading through the
history. It brought me back to from my little childhood right till I got married and all the way through high school and college. It was an adventure. It was something special to go into the city. You had lunch. We had our hair done. Curly-headed children had it done at Best & Company. Oh, yes.
I didn't know.
I went to a high school that my extra parts of my uniform, we could only get at the Altman. I mean, it was just, yes, it was fabulous when you went in. And you were, the little kid was treated as well as his her parents were.
Yeah, I mean, I wish they still had, like, one of the nurseries I know, like, they gave them ice cream and they had like nurses who basically played games with them and stuff while you could go shopping. Pretty amazing.
One last question.
Well, this isn't a question, it's just a comment. I can't wait to read this book. But looking at you, and you're so young and I'm so old. And I'm just saying, like this woman, for me, it's gonna be a walk down history in different ways. Two things. My father was a designer, and so his factory was always on 34th Street in New York. He did, and my uncle did the buying and selling, and my father did the designing, cutting, sewing, had a whole factory. So that whole memory of interacting when I was little, to go into each one of the stores with him, well, we're going to see this person and blah, blah. So that whole thing is in my mind that this, now you've come to know what I grew up with, and now you're sharing it back to us. It's something that's so exciting. And then my grandaunt, who was just this single older woman, started the only department store in Spokane, Washington. I looked to see if it was up in this book, had Ed's, and she was on the Davenport Hotel. Her name is still in. She had the whole corner of Davenport Hotel in Spokane, and her name is still in that store, but that store is no longer there in that same vein as some of these are not there. So I come from knowing that I knew this, but until you talked about it tonight, you've really brought so much to life, and I'm very proud of you for writing.